Well, let me ask you, as you read through this passage this evening, who do you think saved the Hebrews from annihilation? Do you think it was Esther, or do you think it was the Lord God? And if you're not used to Christian things, if you're joining us this evening to check out what all the fuss is about, what it is that we sing about, and who it is that we pray to, you might think it's a bit confusing. But if you're at all familiar with the God of the Bible, then you know that there's nothing to it. But you also know that it's an intensely practical question, because every day we face situations where we ask ourselves, should I act or should I pray? Should I do something or should I wait on the Lord? Should I try or should I trust? And you know that the answer is yes. The answer is yes to all of the above. And in this passage, we see it so clearly that yes, Esther saved the Hebrews from annihilation, and God saved the Hebrews from annihilation. And we will see a little bit more detail how that all worked out together. But the point is that this is why we do act and wait and pray and trust, because we serve the Lord who always is working in all things for our salvation. He's not a God who sometimes works and then the rest of the time we work. He is always at work for our good, for our very best. He is working for our salvation through the deeds of people, whether those people realize it or not. And so we can enjoy in today's passage, once again, seeing that Esther is a brilliant woman. Her diplomacy, her skill, her tact, her power of manipulation, her charm, her timing, her planning, it is all amazing and admirable, and we should take notes, particularly if we're married to a man. But at the same time, we remember that this is the same Esther who this morning insisted on fasting for 3 days before going in to see the king. This is the Esther who knew that this was not going to be all her own work, that salvation was not going to be her doing. And yet, even knowing that, she did go in to see the king. She did risk her life, because while knowing that it was not her doing, but God's doing, she also knew that it was her or nothing, that if she didn't act, then everything was lost. Do you see? She understood what we all know, that yes, we act and God acts, and there's no contradiction there. Both are what is happening. And if we ask even, how did Esther get into that position in the king's court to face that choice? Well, again, it was God's providence who put her there, and it was the careful plotting and planning and work of her uncle and of her to end up being married to the emperor. So God saved his people through Esther. It wasn't 50-50, 50% God's work, 50% Esther's work. No, it was 100% God's work and 100% the work of the human beings whom he chose to use. Esther saved the Hebrews because she was God's provision for salvation. And let's see how this works out today. You remember that the enemy, the one who's going to attack and destroy and annihilate, is this man Haman. If you chose to have a glance at chapter 6 in the sort of the long Sunday break, then you'll see that he's already begun to fall. The end of chapter 6 has him, just being dragged from home, having been told he's going to die by his wife, and being taken off to this fateful banquet. And he has completely lost all initiative. In fact, you see in chapter 7 how it begins, that the king went to dine, and our translation is a little bit loose there. It's the king who went, and Haman with him. Haman doesn't do anything. He's just part of the king's going. And who does the king go to? To Queen Esther. You see, the sentence could have been, Haman the high courtier went, accompanied by the king, to Esther. But you see, that's not what it says. It's the king who goes to the queen, and Haman being dragged along. And Haman doesn't speak another word in the rest of the book. He's done. He is now this marionette hanging from Esther's fingers, even as God uses Esther to undo him. And you see it again in the way that the king turns to address her, and now he addresses her as Queen Esther. And remember that it is God who has done it. It is God who has made her queen. It is God who has got her to this position, but it is Mordecai and Esther's plotting and planning and acting that has got her to this point where she's at a second banquet with the king, being addressed as the queen. So this brilliant tactic is working, because here is the king again saying, please will you now tell me what it is that you want, so that I can once and for all give it to you, whatever it is, you see. And but she hasn't run out of cunning yet. You see, he wants to know, what is your petition, what is your request? He means one thing. He's just using two words to describe the same thing. But you see that in verse 3 she latches onto the two words to ask for two things, and calls one thing the petition and the other one the request. There is no limit to the wiliness of Queen Esther. And all the husbands in the room, I can see, are carefully taking down notes and being on their guard, aren't you? So Esther asks on the one hand, and now husbands and wives are looking at each other, it's brilliant. She asks for her life, and she asks for the life of her people. And you see from the way the king then blurts out his next question in verse 5 that he is clueless, and Haman is clueless. Nobody knows that the queen's life is in danger. But the dreadful clue is in verse 4, where she says that I and my people have been sold for destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. And those are the words that Haman put in that decree. That is what he wanted in his exaggerated way for the Hebrews. And the problem now is that this is a decree not of Haman, but of the king. He signed it. It is law. It cannot be revoked. It's the law of the Medes and the Persians, and it cannot be overturned. And so here is Esther, once again taking this massive risk to her own life, because she is drawing attention to the fact that she is under a death sentence, and the king and everybody in the court doesn't know it. She could have sat quietly and let all of her country folk be wiped out, and nobody would have known that she was one of them. But to save them, she puts her head in the noose. And she puts the king in this quandary, which is why she's so deferential to him. You know, if only I were being sold into slavery along with my entire nation, I wouldn't have troubled you with something so petty and so pilfering. But it's death, you see. So I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd trouble you with it. I would disturb you in my slightly embarrassed way by drawing attention to the fact that your wife is going to be dragged off and killed. So she simply says that her life is in danger, and she doesn't explain why. But the relationship remains thoroughly clear here, doesn't it? King Xerxes asks Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? You see what I mean? That's her position. God has put her there. It isn't being undone. And so the king's cluelessness is about to be corrected, because in verse 6, she identifies the man sitting next to him to drink, to that man's own horror. He is the one who is trying to kill your queen, O king. And at that point, Haman's world collapses. Up until that point, he'd had the world at his feet, the known world. He did everything at the pleasure of Emperor Xerxes. He even wore his signet ring, which is how you know, with a wax seal, you would then make things into law and issue edicts. He had enough money to spare to pay a year's worth of total imperial taxes to do his little sideshow hobby of murdering Mordecai and all his people. And now he is terrified of the king who until now was his best friend. Why is he terrified of the king? Because of Queen Esther. Why is he terrified of Queen Esther? Because of God's work to put her there. How did God do that work? Through Mordecai and through Esther. Esther is saving her people. God is saving her people. And then the king, understandably, on discovering what Haman is planning to do to his wife, in verse 7, becomes enraged. But he's put in an impossible situation. He's got to choose between his best wife and his best courtier, between Esther and Haman. He's going to have to displease and please one of them and not the other. He can't ask his court for advice because Haman is one of his courtiers, so he runs outside to have a quiet think in the fresh air. And at this point, Haman, who had already begun metaphorically to fall before the Hebrew Mordecai, and whose wife had said to him that he cannot but fall before the Hebrew people, well, he now literally falls before this woman, prostrate, but whom he hadn't even realized was one of the Hebrews. And at that point, you get the beautiful coincidence in the passage, the God incident, where the king miraculously happens to walk in at the very point where Haman is reclining on the queen's couch to beg her for his life, and he sees her there and about to plead for his life. And this is the one moment when this absurd king turns wily in the entire book, because he's needed an excuse to condemn Haman without making reference to the fact that he, the king, has issued this edict to kill his wife. And how has he managed to do that? And there he sees him falling on his wife, and he cries rape and says, "Are you now going to murder?" He knows perfectly well what's going on. He knows that there's a man pleading for his wife. He's not about to try anything funny, but that then means that the attendants grab him and drag him off, and his servants are rather quick on the uptake, and they provide him, do you see it there in verse 9, with the final excuse, because one of them pipes up and says, there's this huge gallows out there, 75 feet high, don't you know, and Haman built it, and do you know who he built it for? He built it to kill Mordecai. Mordecai, by the way, who saved your life, O king. It's the excuse we need. Treason. Not only has he tried to molest the king's wife, he's also tried to murder the man who saved the king's life. So here now comes Haman's elevation at Queen Esther's banquet that he had been boasting to his wife about. Here is the unique access to this party cashing out as they drag him off and hang him on that giant gallows. So much for Haman, so much for the immediate threat to Esther's life. But then, do you see it there at the end of verse 10? The king's fury subsided. And that's the problem. This fickle king only cares about the fact that his wife was in the crosshairs, that there was effrontery against the queen. So he's avenged her and her honor by hanging Haman, but he doesn't lift a finger to defend her, and certainly not her people. He actually does nothing to answer Queen Esther's request. She had asked for her life and the life of all her countrymen. And the king hasn't solved the problem, that they're all still under a death sentence. And so Esther finds herself in that position that we find ourselves in now, that victory begun, but there's still work to do. There is work for Esther and Mordecai to do. And so with us, Jesus has already defeated Satan at the cross. Satan has been for a while bound. And yet, all of us remain with indwelling sin of Adam, with the carnage and the damage that Satan has caused in the world. That is still all around us. And so, after that decisive victory 2 millennia ago, there remains for us that slow, patient task of evangelizing the world, of people turning to Christ, of all of us who've turned to Christ maturing into Christ, of restoring us to the true humanity that we were meant to be. In a word, what remains is to save the world, even after Jesus already died to save it. And that will take us all the way until Jesus returns. There won't be any spare time after that. It's not going to be the work of a week, as we know, because it's been 2 millennia and counting. And that's okay. We learn from Esther, don't we, that God saved his people and Esther and Mordecai's work saved his people. So it's all right. Jesus has saved the world and we are saving the world. It's no problem. It's no confusion. It just takes time for the decisive work of Christ to be applied to every person, to every nation. But how are they going to solve this problem? Well, in chapter 8, we now find that Mordecai is the new Haman. He's given his property. He appears before the king. He's given the king's signet ring. He's the top dog now. He sits at the right-hand side of the emperor, just as Jesus sits at the right-hand side of the majesty on high. But as with Mordecai, so with Jesus, death for his people remains, and there is work to do to save them. So what we will see again in this chapter is once again the brilliance of Esther and Mordecai, and how that is God's provision to save his people for himself. See, here's the problem for the king. He has been complicit, though he didn't know it, in the death of Esther's people. And so he wants to bury it. He just doesn't want it to be known that he has been, caught out in this embarrassing trap. He wants to save Esther and save Mordecai, but actually let all the others be killed quietly without anybody knowing that he blundered. And then he can carry on with his partying and with his fickle mood swings. So Esther's amazing diplomacy is needed again. Having failed with any kind of reason and logic to get the king to see the nose in front of his own face, she then cries. You see, she starts weeping and she starts begging. And once again, this had been an unauthorized entry, so she's risking her life once again. But the king in verse 4 extends his gold scepter. Her life for now saved again. And that means that in verse 5, she's got permission to speak. She's once again in this position of this doting husband, willing to listen. What is she going to ask for? Well, what could she ask for? What could she appeal to? Could she appeal to the king's goodness? He doesn't seem to have shown that he knows right from wrong yet. Could he appeal to his justice? No, this is a king whose anger and whose rage and whose petulance causes him to banish people and kill people without really much thought. Could he appeal to any kind of promise the king has made? Well, no, he hasn't made one. This king he couldn't care less. So what can she appeal to? Well, the king loves her, so she appeals to her own hurt feelings. Verse 6, she says, "For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" And the king's reply amounts to saying, "Look, I've done enough. I've done all I can." In verse 7, he relates in verse 7 what he's already done: killed Haman, given over his estate to Esther, and so on. And what more could I possibly do? And so in verse 8, he basically gives her permission to write something that cannot be written. You see, because the edict of the king, the law of the king, cannot be overturned. And somebody has brilliantly and wittily described the king's reply to Esther like this. Let me read it for you. "Write what you like," says the king, "as long as it doesn't overturn, revoke, or contradict anything previously written. Write what you like to Jewish advantage," says the king, "as long as you realize that Haman's decree still stands. Write what you like," says the king, "it will bear my seal. But remember that so does every other official document, including Haman's letter. Write what you like," says the king, "but I give up. The conundrum of how to revoke an irrevocable decree, as you, Esther, have asked, is beyond me. But feel free to write what you like, if you can think of a way to reverse the irreversible." Well, Mordecai comes up with the solution where the king's patience and the king's wit has run out. He writes an edict, as Johan read for us earlier, very much like Haman's, and he sends it everywhere at top speed, very much like Haman's. That time is against us. And the solution isn't to say, I now forbid you from attacking the Jews. No, you can't do that. That would revoke the previous decree. The decree has to stand. The solution is that the Jews are allowed to organize themselves and defend themselves. Do you see that in verse 11? That's his solution. Okay, so the mob can attack them, but they are allowed to fight back. They're allowed to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force that comes against them. And that turns the tables for them. So in verse 15, the king takes off Mordecai takes off the sackcloth that he'd been wearing to mourn the impending death of his people, puts on royal garments. And in verse 16, the whole capital, all the Hebrews are there with happiness, joy, gladness, and honor. No more fasting, no more dirges, just happiness all around, which was utter nonsense. It was completely premature, wasn't it? Because when we do the maths on the calendar, there were 9 months to wait before the day of the attack on the Hebrews. Nobody knew how it had gone. So what on earth is anybody celebrating for? How do they know it's going to work? They're saying that groups of Hebrews are allowed to assemble, but how many of them were there? They're allowed to defend themselves against an armed force. Have they got weapons to defend themselves against an armed force? They're going to be slaughtered. So why on earth has he taken off his sackcloth? Why on earth are all the Hebrews in the capital celebrating? Well, because Haman has been killed, because the arch enemy has been defeated, and because Mordecai, this Hebrew, is now in his place on the throne. It's a sign of the beginning of the victory. It's a sign of the surety of the victory. See, why do we Christians now, and even for 2,000 years now, why do we not only sing dirges about our own sin, about persecution, about the lost? Why do we also sing hymns to celebrate our salvation? How can we do that in a world full of the lost? How can we do that when we are so grieved by our own sin? Why? Because the Son of Man is already on the throne. Because everything that's going on down here, we see through the eyes of knowing that we have our own flesh in heaven at the right-hand side of God the Father, ruling all things. And we know that he will protect us. We know that he will give us victory. And that is why there was celebration in Susa, to say, well, Haman is not in charge anymore. Mordecai is in charge. It will be okay. But how? How will it be okay? Did you notice that at the end of verse 17, the very end of our passage? And many people of other nationalities became Jews, became Hebrews, because fear of the Jews had seized them. And that's where the matter ends. You see, we've had all of this rushing around. We've had all of this plotting, all of the urgent action of Mordecai and of Esther, and this especially urgent rush to send the messengers out to make sure that no province receives the edict to annihilate before they receive the edict to protect. And what was it all for? What was God's hidden hand? What was God doing behind all of this? You see, he wasn't merely putting his people in danger only then to save them. He had another plan. He was going beyond that. He was doing what he loves to do, God's favorite way of dealing with the enemy, the proper way that God deals with the enemy, not the unusual, improper way. The proper way that he deals with his enemies is to convert them. The way that God loves to remove trouble from God's people is not to remove the troublemakers, but to have them join his people. And he does that while at the same time defending his people, defending his bride. So you see, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not either the Christians win or their enemies win. It's they both win, because the enemies become Christians and receive their salvation. And because of that, they're no longer attacking God's people. So God's people win, because they're no longer being attacked. He keeps defending his bride and converting the enemies of his bride until the son returns for his wedding feast. Now you might ask, well, by what device does he do this? What is this protection? What is this force by which God protects us? How does he defend his bride? It is with his word. That is how he does it. That is what happened to these people of other nationalities. Fear had seized them. Why? Because they heard of the mighty works that God had been doing. And that's the thing that you read all through the Old Testament. The Jews arrive in a place and news, not of them, but of their God, goes before them. How are we kept safe? By the preaching of the gospel that turns our enemies into our brothers, that turns God haters into God's children. When we're worried about a tyrant, when we're worried about a tyranny, when we're worrying about law, whether it's governments and their laws, or the local mafia, or the local gang, or the local, whatever it is, when we're worried about these things, what's the solution? What is our defense? Our defense is to share the gospel with our neighbors. Our defense is to share the gospel with our co-workers. Why? Because that is how God defends his bride, by turning enemies into friends. And he will not stop doing that until he returns. So with that certain knowledge, we're going to sing a paraphrase of Psalm 149, which celebrates that very thing that God is doing through history, of defending his people by causing us to share the gospel with our enemies until that day when our enemies will be defeated if they will not turn.